Mike Matsibula from Swaziland. I found one statement very interesting from Professor Erasmus' introduction, and that is the Nigerian attitude at this stage in the context of the ECOWAS EPA. He mentioned that it's kind of late in the day because all along we all thought that ECOWAS, like all the other regions, would be completing their negotiations, but suddenly this does not seem to be the case in the case of ECOWAS. It's interesting in the sense that the reasons being advanced, at least the summary that was given to us, are reasons which have merit. Essentially, at least that's my reading of the summary that was given, Nigeria is saying we've got too much to lose if we rush to signing the EPA. Let us try another route. And the other route is Nigeria itself, because it's a huge economy, and possibly Africa. And my interest is in the African connection. If we had time, which unfortunately we don't in the SADC EPA case, we have only a few more weeks to decide whether we sign or we don't. But all indications are that within a few weeks there will be conclusion of the negotiations, and therefore we've lost out on a debate that maybe would have generated better benefits had we had time to engage in it. The other regions in Africa are not, I would like to speculate, really featuring high in the Nigerian agenda for their own industrialization efforts. They are more interested in an inward-looking developmental effort where they will be favoring things coming in that will help them industrialize, and everything else will be cut out. We could have said, if we had time, well, let's talk Nigeria. If you really want to use the African connection as the basis of your development, let us start talking Africa-wide integration. And this inward-looking approach maybe should be moderated a bit or given a short period of time. I am emphasizing this inward perhaps on very thin data. I'm using their approach when dealing with the cement issue. They were a net importer of cement, and they decided we want to have self-sufficiency in cement, and they succeeded. And in the process of succeeding, they closed off their borders. They are now focusing on the sugar sector, where they are aiming for self-sufficiency in sugar production within the next 10 years. Again, this is an inward looking kind of approach. They are going to be giving the entry of machinery, anything, any input that is going into the sugar industry will be virtually duty-free. But anything that's competing with the sugar, just as was the case for cement, is going to be heavily taxed or eventually kept out. And if you're using the African connection, then that kind of approach is not ideal for Africa as a whole. So in summary, my comment is that I found the statement by Professor Erasmus very interesting. I only wish we had time. We don't have time in as far as the EPA negotiations are concerned. However, we do have time if some elements of the Nigerian approach could then be used to see whether we could forge an African connection towards industrialization and development. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, I find myself at odds when we in the EAC up to now seem to be very desirous to promote the issues that are coming up under the EPAs. If you look at the very agreements that we have had all along, I mean, for example, the very agreement, the Georgetown Agreement that created the SCP configuration, this was 1975, shortly before I was born. But it's quite amazing that since 75, when I was born up to today, we failed to come up with anything. And if you look at the Georgetown Agreement, the main components and objectives was sustainable development and poverty reduction. And it's quite amazing, since 1975 in the Georgetown Agreement till today, we failed to have sustainable development, neither has poverty reduction gone on. And what is conspicuously funny is that if you look at how the configuration of the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific states was made, it was purposely carved out to leave out the strong economies and make a collection of poor economies and hold them together into an agreement of the SCP states. Chair, my humble belief would be that we should get advice from the strongest economies on the African continent, that in light of the EPA configuration, South Africa should give us a very noble voice that we ought to listen to. And if Nigeria now comes up and says that equally I'm not into it, then we must wake up. Because I'm looking at my capital that in Kampala, if you've got a fund that has come in from the EU and it is purposely to promote the EPAs, and all you do it is workshop after workshop, seminar after seminar, residential workshop after, but it hasn't helped us. And really looking at the African economies that we are tied to the duties we get, and you are telling us duty-free, quota-free market access. It's quite a challenge that till now, many African governments haven't yet seen that. Can you really support your government with a duty-free, quota-free market access? And the voices that have seen it happen before should have advised that what happened in the Caribbean under the CARIFORUM. It became very disastrous, very sad, and no one would like that replicated. But unless we are ready to see what befell our brothers in the north, like the Arab Spring, I'm very worried the Arab Spring is going to trickle down into all the EPA states. Because up to now, what happened in the Arab Spring of very many unemployed youths is now going to trickle down to the SCP states. So, Chair, what I would like to advise Professor is that, mainly for the EAC, we seek your noble guidance and wisdom, because the governments haven't seen it. It's all about, there is a fund from EU that is promoting EPAs, and that is it. But at the end of the day, are we winners? Because currently, the EAC, on one hand, we have the EAC. It's not yet a perfect blueprint. We are negotiating tripartite. It's there. At the same time, the EAC has the AGOA. It's on its table. At the same time, we've got very many TIFAs. We are doing a TIFA with the USA. We are doing another TIFA with Turkey. We are having bilaterals with China. I mean, at the end of the day, you ask one country that if you ever asked a state like Uganda, that can you assemble your negotiators in front there? It's 3-4 people. If you ever asked the country of 37 million Ugandans that can you please assemble your trade negotiators, you're looking at 1, 2, 3 faces who have done it year in, year out. But you're having EPAs, tripartite, you're having ESC, you're having bilaterals, China is coming, Turkey is coming, all of that. So what we would be happy is that through tralac and through the big states on the economy, that is South Africa and Nigeria, let us have a sound argument, both in print, both in write, as well as dialogue meetings with our heads of state and partners on really what is the devil. The biggest devil has been all member states in the ESC as well as in the tripartite, not to notice the one devil. The devil in the entire EPA configuration is one. If you can look at the global configuration in the 60s, 50s, 60s up to the early 70s and 80s, we had what was the British territory, the French territory, the German territory, and the world was divided in geographic configurations of whose territory. This is the British territory. But as we've gone ahead because of globalization, we now notice that there is only one territory in this world, and that is the Chinese territory. That for whatever you touch, whatever you use, for whatever you see is made and produced in China. Now, the EU isn't happy about this. That, I mean, someone has taken over their territory. We used to have a French territory. We used to have a British territory. Now, the Chinese have swept all over, and for whatever, let it be the latest iPad, the latest iPhone, is all made in China. The EU isn't happy about this. And what are they now doing? They are coming to the ACP partner states and saying, can you do explicit and expeditious agreements on substandards and counterfeits? Not because of anything, because China has taken over their market in terms of bringing the poor quality, the low grade, the substandard, and all that. Now, in order to reclaim their territories of the British, the French, the German, and all that, is to bring the EPA agreement on table. But what we must really agree is that the EPAs are not going to take us anywhere. If they did not take the Caribbean, and if we are agreeing that today it's a world of globalization, it's trade with me, you trade is trade, and that is all. So I don't see us moving anywhere with the EPAs, but like I've said, tralac as well as the other big states in the continent, please help us drive these drums bigger. Let's make a louder sound so that probably Brussels might listen and action might be taken. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. In fact, I don't have stories to tell because I think my brothers have spoken a lot. And many ideas have been spoken about the EPA, so I'm not going there. I just wanted to zero in on African solidarity versus economic negotiations in Africa. And I would wish to pick the brains of the Professor Erasmus to say, in the African context, we have those countries that have been grouped as least developed, who have that market access and EBAs. And we have those that have been grouped as developing countries, like the four that you mentioned that have signed under ESA configuration. Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, and Kenya was in that dilemma, hence the EAC initialing of the EPA. Now, other than we are technocrats here, I don't want us to go the route of sounding, is EPA good or not or bad for us and things like that. I just want to pick your brain on the fact that in this grouping that now you have even said, Angola says they want to go EBA. And there are several who say that. The dynamics on the ground are not the same when you talk about solidarity. So what do you do when you're faced with such a situation? We primarily export similar goods to the EU, agricultural, name them, the coffees and the teas and the flowers of this world. We are doing the same exports. So if we lose that market or we go GSP, and some of those products may not necessarily be under GSP anyway, at their rules of origin, as you rightly put it. So what do countries like the five I've mentioned, whom I'm aware of, do? Because I also know that when this initialing was taking place, in the corridor of Brussels, there was traitor, you have become a traitor, you have done this. You talked about a divided house. Can you help me understand technically? Thank you.
My name is Axel Pougin de la Maisonneuve. I work for the EU delegation in Pretoria. And I feel I've got to watch my words today. And I'll try not to be too long, maybe 2 or 3 ideas to throw in the discussion. First one is I appreciated the focus of Professor Erasmus on the fact that after something like 10 years of a difficult process, we are quite advanced in the negotiations, but it's not finished on that side. And there is already a lot that we can harvest in terms of lessons learned. And I would say not only from the African side, but also from the EU side. We can look with retrospect at what we have tried to achieve. In the 1990s, there was some agreement between the ACPs and the EU following a number of studies, separate EU studies, separate ACP studies, common EU ACP studies, that EPA was a meaningful way to go forward in terms of adjusting our trade relationship to a new economic context and to the WTO rules as well, in terms of reciprocity. And the situation in the 90s was obviously permitting this, and it's clear that there have been shifts, huge shifts since then, which indeed make the EPAs, to a certain extent, on some of the components that were thought through in the 90s, quite irrelevant to the current context. With retrospect, we would probably have thought more carefully about introducing the regional integration dimension into the EPA. We thought in the 90s that the EPA could be a useful tool to promote regional integration. What we have discovered since then was that we had overestimated probably the state of advancement of the regional integration processes in Africa. And the EPA has been held hostage of the situation to a large extent. Well, this is the negative way to see it. The positive way to see it is probably to say that at least it's put the fingers on the problems, and that it's forced the various partners to try to think constructively about solutions. I have personally followed the EPA process since the beginning, at least as far as SADC is concerned. I was in 2004 in July in Windhoek. I'm sure Jürgen was there also for the launch of the SADC-EPA negotiations. And I was on the Tanzanian side, if I can say so, because I was based in the EU delegation in Dar es Salaam. So I was also an observer of that very difficult a reflection in Tanzania about where do we belong, at least in terms of a customs union or prospect for a customs union. Are we looking at EAC? Are we looking at SADC? And that was a very difficult discussion, which the EPA, to a certain extent, was a revealing factor of, and forced Tanzania to get its acts together in terms of which customs union you opt for.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm only started. But yeah, my point was that yes, it's a lessons learned process which has already started, and there is indeed a big harvest we can make. I would say on the EU side as well, there have been mistakes which have been done, and to a large extent we have probably to a large extent readjusted our expectations, re-evaluated the type of political and trade relations we can have with Africa, with the African countries, with the REX, with the EU as a whole. And when you look at the way the negotiations are conducted on our side at the moment, this is nothing to do with what took place 10 years ago. I think we have taken on board the fact that we have, at least as far as SADC is concerned, we have refocused the agreement towards trade in goods to a large extent. The trade-related issues are limited to a minimum in terms of competition, for example, in terms of services, in terms of taxation, in terms of sustainable development. We have really an agreement on the table being finalized, hopefully, which is focused on trade in goods and the market access dimension. Also in terms of lessons learned, we have learned also that we have to adjust to the new reality of in developmental industrial policy in Southern Africa, at least, to a certain extent in the EAC as well. And we have tried to negotiate agreements which reflect that new reality. If you take export duties, which, as was said rightfully, is one of the two last items to be negotiated, to be concluded in the context of the SADC-EPA. We have, for the first time, with the EU, opened up on export duties. There will be a possibility for the SADC-EPA group and for each country individually to apply export duties. The negotiation at the moment doesn't deal with the principle, it deals with the number of products which can be subject to export duties and with the duration of the measures. But this is the first time we make such an opening. It goes contrary to the principles that the EU has been supporting over the years at WTO in particular. It shows a willingness to be pragmatic and to adjust to the political priorities of our trade partners in Africa. So it's not perfect. It's been a very hectic process, very complex, very difficult. But I think at the end of the day, there have been a lot of lessons learned, not only from your side, but also from our side.
I just wanted to hear the professor's views on the fact that South Africa has signed the EPA, and South Africa is basically the driver of SACU. Isn't that effectively, in terms of the practical realities, that SACU has signed an EPA with Europe through South Africa? And to what extent are the BNLS countries able, on their own, to have a meaningful EPA with Europe without South Africa's active participation? For instance, Botswana's major trading partner is South Africa, outside the diamond industry. And wouldn't it make sense for the BNLS countries to have an EPA with South Africa than with Europe? Thank you.
My name is Ndita Ngepondoka Robiati, and I'm from the Namibia Trade Forum. Like Axel and a few others, I've also been involved in the negotiations, and I can really claim that most of my youth was taken up in the EPAs. And I just want to talk or make comments regarding regional integration and our ability, or how that was overtaken by the events. And in this regard, I'd like to talk about export taxes. So with the latest text that the SADC EPA group has received from the EU, there is an MFN clause in the export tax. Remember that the MFN tax clause was already cleared in the last round. And this time it says that if a SADC EPA state gives a third party more preferable conditions with export taxes, then those should be granted as well to the EC. And if you read very, very carefully, that would undo basically what we have done at SADC. Because remember, in the SADC trade protocol, we have there's a prohibition on export taxes. And our big dilemma is, has this clause been applied in the other EPA configurations where SADC member states belong to? Because that will really undo what we have already covered in the MFN clause. And then the other technical thing, I mean, this is just for information, I think it boils down again to what Professor was talking about yesterday, the ratification process. Because if you recall that market access regulation, the one that granted us the market access after 2007, it says that countries should have ratified the agreement, right, by the 1st of October. And at this point in time, it doesn't look like anybody would have ratified that agreement because of our different legislative processes. So the question then begs is, can trade be disrupted while we are still negotiating? Before it has, for example, in SADC EPA state, we're still remaining with the 2 articles. By 1st of October, if this is not concluded, will trade be disrupted while we are still negotiating? Professor, I just want to hear from maybe your opinions on that based on the Vienna Convention. And yeah, I also agree with Axel that a lot has been learned. And I think from SACU, I believe we are a stronger family. I think it has also taught us a lot of lessons on how we can really advance regional integration, and that we've had to ask ourselves a lot of difficult questions.
Please answer the last gentleman.
With which one?
Paul, Ndita is better placed to answer the concerns from Botswana about that you've just heard about the BLNS going this way or that way.
I don't think I'm better placed, but based on my conclusions, I would say that SACU has had a lot of time to consider and meditate and question a lot of things about our arrangement. And I can say that you recall that in 2007, when most members initialed and 2 did not, We had a lot of time to pause and think, and we have moved together, and there was a council and summit decision that says that we will do everything together as a group, and that's the whole reason why it was insisted that South Africa becomes part of the EPA, because then we can maintain the integrity of the customs union. And we know that with the customs union, South Africa is all our biggest trader. You know, and even if the income from Europe does matter with jobs, but we know that there's that common revenue pool that is there, and if that's dismantled, a lot of the fundamentals of our economies have not yet had time to adjust to the new reality. So I think, for me, I do believe that SACU is in a better position today than it was, I say, in 2007, if that answers it slightly. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for all the contributions. There are very few questions, but I would just like to respond very quickly to one or two principles that are now suggested. Thank you, Mike. The first set of observations about industrialization in Nigeria. Now, you have filled us in on very important matters which we will have to consider for our own debate, our intra-Africa integration and trade debate. If that is the pattern, Mike, of industrialization by the African hegemons, as you have described it, and you've cited the example of cement, namely, and I'm quoting you, inward-looking, sealing off the borders and selectively using the tariff, that has very serious implications. And only being a lawyer, I can't fully grasp the political economy consequences of that, so Trudy and Paul and others, you will have to jump in there. But if that is the recipe for African industrialization, and it has the consequences, the knock-on consequences for being the foundation of our trade policies with the rest of the world and for Africa, then we're into a new ballgame. And if the industrial pillar of the continental FTA will look like that, and Mike's indication is that it will, otherwise it will not be consistent and logical, then we've got a serious debate in our own ranks that we will have to look straight in the eyes. So thank you very much for that. But it also has the other benefit. It demonstrates that Nigeria has gone through a process of analyzing its own needs and its own industrial policy or national development policy, and that was the outcome of it. But it's a national policy and a national approach. And you are saying, if we had more time to look at that dimension when we discuss the EPAs, maybe we could have come out with a better result or a better understanding for African integration. Mike, I doubt it. I doubt it. But you will have your second bite of the apple with the continental FTA being around the corner. Then we should not have the excuse after a number of more years to say, if we had more time. Thank you for the timely warning, Mike, that we should start thinking about the Nigerian example of African industrialization / solidarity / integration / brotherhood and sisterhood. So thank you for the reminder. It's firmly on the agenda now. Ndita, thank you so much for technical clarification and for very effectively answering the concerns of our colleague from Botswana there, because in that I detect in the formulation of that question, what is the better way for us to go forward, with or without South Africa? And that is another debate. It's a national debate, it's a regional debate, but you have answered from your perspective that particular concern. We cannot fully answer you, sir. We cannot fully answer you. Those are very important national sensitivities. But the points that you have introduced, Ndita, about the realities around SACU are paramount. They are vital. And there is And we have people who can hear from the floor, who can, in the tea time, enlighten us on this. But there is an insufficient debate in the SACU structures about the future of SACU. I think there's a non-debate. SACU suffers from, what is that medical term, if you haven't got sufficient oxygen in your bloodstream? Anemia. But iron, is it iron? Yeah, that's a nice metaphor. SACU hasn't got iron in its blood. SACU faces a challenge, and it also faces a challenge about the common revenue pool. Now, the gentleman from Uganda has addressed us in a manner which I find difficult always to follow, but let me start with his conclusion. And he said, the EPAs will not take us anywhere. What will? What will take us where? Pardon? More investment and more trade. Trade and investment. Yes, we all want more trade and investment. What will take us there? Trudy will answer that one. Axel, but let me just say in detail, this issue about an MFN dimension in the export taxes clause, it's a very interesting technical development. I haven't seen that text. We will have a look at it and maybe write something about it. But that is the typical outcome of negotiations where you will have to come together. But you've made an important point then, and that is, what will the same formulation be in all the other EPAs? And how will that laterally impact on integration? Well, if they all have the same principle, then it seems to me that there will be clarity. At this point, I haven't studied it, but at this point it seems to me that it is, given the fact that the principle of export taxes is now accepted, and that it is about, if I understand Axel correctly, about the identity of the products, or the number of products and the value, and the time frame. Okay, so there's an interesting thing that we must put on the website, and that is the formulation and what does it mean, and thank you very much for that. Ratification before the 1st of October. I don't think if there is political finalization of text and agreed on a text, and there was signature of the text, it will take a long time in terms of domestic constitutional procedures. You're quite right, for all the ratifications to be finalized before the 1st of October. But that shouldn't derail it. I think that is something that the Commission in Brussels will, from a political point of view, and given the request by some nations for flexibility, I think that will be accommodated. I wouldn't be concerned about the technical derailing because ratification was not possible. And it's not only ratification, it is depositing the instruments of ratification at different moments in time before. I don't think that will derail it. That is my final contribution. Thank you for your indulgence, patience, and the fact that you have not succumbed to the temptation of becoming a dictator.
I think it's an important topic, because I think there are issues emanating from the interventions on the ground. There are many people, there are actually people saying different things and different strategy of how do we participate in negotiations. And I think it's an important issue for this conference to realize. If you look at Trudy's remark yesterday, he started saying there's shifts happening. And we are seeing it also in the EPA. I mean, even the representative from the EU has clearly stated these shifts. I'm telling you, if I'm from Namibia and I was in the Ministry of Trade, if Namibia was a sovereign in terms of trade policy, not part of SACU, that time then, we could have signed this thing long time ago. Huh? Because the policy environment, the environment that time was so conducive to us signing that. But today, it could be a different game. And that's a question we asked, even when you look at the SADC Treaty. That article I mentioned as a beginning in 1992 was easy to adopt. Nobody was complaining about free movement of people, of service, of whatever. Today is a different game. So we have to start thinking into this context as well. And we have to start thinking, what is an appropriate response to what we are experiencing today? Is it the Nigerian response? Would it take us somewhere? Or is there another alternative response? Those are the issues we need to debate. And I think the commercial representative raised an important question, you didn't answer that, around solidarity and the question that countries are affected differently. Whether an EPA or not, countries are affected differently. The way Nigeria is affected is not necessarily the way Namibia is affected. And if we have to have solidarity, whose solidarity, on whose side?
Yeah, but is there a debate at all about about being affected? It's impossible to answer that question because the way that things are structured at the moment is that every nation or every configuration, if they are sufficiently integrated, should have this debate amongst themselves. Do we do so properly? I don't think we do so properly in SACU. Do we have the structures? Do we have the inclination? Do we do it in SADC? Do we do it in the EAC? These debates that are prerequisites for those answers will open up all the concerns and the different views. And then, as you pointed out, we will see another debate about the validity of solidarity under the conditions of today, or the scope for that. What does it mean? Is it really there? Variable geometry, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, variable geometry has become a very, very important notion in the new generation of intra-African negotiations. In the next session, we're going to mention it. I'm going to remind you of the negotiating principles of the tripartite. It doesn't recognize development status, S&D, automatically, and it emphasizes the acquis and it emphasizes variable geometry. There is, under our eyes, already another debate about your concerns, but sorry, thanks for reminding me.
Zodwa Mabuza from Swaziland. Just a question from, which is directed to Professor. On the issue of export taxes, you mentioned that one of the sticking points within the EPAs, one of the two is the issue of export taxes. And coincidentally, that's an issue as well within the tripartite FTA negotiations. My understanding is that from the SADC trade protocol, I understand that there is an article on the prohibition of export taxes, and it's understandable. I mean, if you are going to trade among ourselves as developing countries, you may want to have some flexibility with regard to that. But then if you're trading with a much stronger economy like the EU, maybe you would want to have a relook at that article. In particular, within the tripartite, you have countries that are saying, let's have an article on the prohibition of export taxes. But then you have countries that are saying, no, we want to do away with that article because we want to promote value addition. But my thinking again is that if we have this developmental approach among us as Africans and we want to create a much wider market, we should have that flexibility. But then the question to you—
To do what?
Okay, you can have, you must do away with that, okay.
Do you want export taxes in the tripartite or not?
No, we don't want them. Because
Okay.
you want to create a much wider market. You want, if Swaziland wants to get diamonds from Botswana and process them, yes, allow us to do that, because you want to create one market. But the question then is, what is best practice? Because as I'm saying, within the tripartite, you have those that are saying, let's have an article on the prohibition of export taxes, but we have others that are saying, no, we don't want that among ourselves. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Erasmus, for your insightful discussion and explanation of all the points that are very important in the present discussion. However, I would like to look at the way forward. And the way forward is that the EPAs are a short-term solution to a long-term problem. And the long-term problem is that in most commodities that we are exporting, we are overtaken by other entities, Brazil, the Mercosur, or India, for a longer term, well thought of policy regarding our export of commodities. On the other hand, the import of the European Union, as explained in the agricultural safeguards, will not only stay there, but will increase. Also, the export of minerals and metals will increase without beneficiation over the next 10 years or 20 years. But it's very important to realize that the EPAs, in a sense, are a short-term solution to a longer-term problem, and that's the competitiveness of the African continent. Thank you.
Let me express really my satisfaction of being here. And I think for me, this is my first time to be here with really the technical negotiators that actually are talking about something very concrete. And the discussion is very important because the way I see it, when I sit at the minister level and also sometimes at the head of state level, I can see really the disconnect. Because sometimes, for example, I give a specific example. We're talking about regional integration. And then we're talking about, negotiating on the EPA. Is it possible to have the cost of non-integration so that we can all know that if we do, for example, EPA, and if it hinders or create any problem for our regional integration, this is what we're losing. I think that it's important for us to come figure-wise, because again, at the head of state level, they cannot talk about export taxes, MFN. I think when you have numbers, they will understand better. I also want to say something. I think that as far as I sit, and at least logically, Nigeria have done their study. It's done their study to say that our focus is our people, and we have our industrialization. And for me, I don't believe it's late. As long as you don't sign something, I think that when you realize something is wrong for you or is affecting your economy, I think you should react to it correctly on a timely basis. So these are the questions. I want to know if we can have the cost of non-integration. What do we gain by integrating? And then we can see what do we gain from the other side on all the bilateral and multilateral negotiation. Thank you very much.
Very quickly to Zotwa. Zotwa, you are asking me, the manner in which you are asking me about export taxes is very important. You're asking me, when this issue of export taxes is negotiated in a tripartite context, and you're pointing out some are for it and others are against it, what is the best practice? That's the wrong question. That's the wrong question. There's no principle here involved, or a legal philosophy involved, or a best practice internationally that we can tap into and then that will guide us. We will have to do our own homework. We will have to work through the consequences and the practicalities. And we will have to understand, and there the lawyers are not particularly good at explaining it, but the linkages between industrialization and the role of tariffs in that and the export tax in that. Mike's example of the export of the industrialization of Nigeria provides examples of how unilaterally a particular country will design an industrial policy for itself which will make sense, and then it will use its tariff regime, its tariff book, its customs policy in order to pursue that. Whether it will pursue that for the purposes and the objectives of regional integration and continental integration, Fatima, is a completely different question. The one doesn't follow on the other. As I understand the explanation from Mike, it's a purely national policy. And you're right, they've done their homework. But their homework was about what is our national industrial policy and how should we move forward. Now, if we individually do our homework as participating members in the tripartite, some member countries will come up because they will see the potential of an export tax for themselves in their national industrial development policy to use it. And they may have, as Trudy reminded us yesterday, have some possibilities lined up about the expensive procedures and the costs that might be involved in beneficiation. Your example about importing diamonds from Botswana and cutting and beneficiating them in Swaziland is a good example. Those are very expensive exercises, and governments don't provide that sort of finance. They provide the policy framework for that. So the way to look at that debate about whether it is good or not for us, whether we want it in that agreement or not, should actually go the route that we have very effectively negotiated and discussed this issue in the context of the EPAs. We will have to work out the scenarios. We'll have to think it through. We cannot see that, as it is unfortunately sometimes seen, as an emotional issue. Others from outside want to ram something down our throats, and therefore we kick in the heels. No one should ever ram anything in anyone's throat, not in a baby's and not in an adult's throat. Don't do the throat thing. But the policy issue, the policy decisions that will create legal instruments for us on our future conduct amongst ourselves and in the context of regional integration, there are no shortcuts. We'll have to do the homework. Thank you also, Jürgen, for reminding us very correctly about competitiveness challenges around the corner.
Yes, the discussion will continue in the context of the tripartite. We are bringing this issue, and at the end, we'll try to make out what is this all about. The EPA experience, and we are seeing a repetition of some of this experience, even in our own house, in the tripartite. And we are seeing, as you are saying, Zodwa, that even in the SADC trade protocol, say, for instance, export tax are outlawed. They're not allowed. But the same countries who have now signed and ratified the SADC trade protocol, they are going into the tripartite and they are singing the song of export taxes.
If you have to read
what is happening, we have to understand that. We're not blaming each other, but we understand what is happening. What are the shifts? Where are we going? What does it say for us, for the future, for participating in the 21st century? What is this all about? These are the questions I think this conference is trying to entertain as well.
May I ask you a final one, Paul? If we in SADC have to renegotiate that trade protocol today, what do you think will we come up with on that clause on export taxes, intra-SADC? Will we be able to be as generous as we were in the 1990s?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's just like even in the WTO. What South Africa negotiated in the WTO in 1994, during the Uruguay round. And I think there are significant shifts now that if South Africa was negotiating now the Uruguay round, the outcome would be different. And those are the questions. And what does it say for regional integration as well? These are the questions we are grappling with.